You know him from TV. He's famous. Bomani Jones! Alright, man, how you doing?
I can't complain.
Thanks
But
for
if you tell
coming
people
on.
I'm famous, but dude, if you tell people I'm famous, they're gonna start trying to borrow money from me, which means I'm gonna come get it from you.
Okay, well, if you do that, I'm gonna take my shirt off, and then you're gonna have to, stay away, because you don't deal with dudes who have their shirt off in their Twitter avatar.
I don't understand the mentality that leads you to believe that that's the way that you want to represent yourself. I just don't get that. Like, even if women like happen to like it, I just can't understand how you think, you know what, I don't have a shirt on. So a friend of mine, one friend of hers had added me, and he'd been reading my stuff for years or something like that. And she asked him, she's like, hey, I added Bomani on Facebook. He wouldn't respond, Is it because I don't have a shirt on in my picture? Yes, that is exactly why.
All right, so if you want to be friends and you want to talk to Bomani on Twitter, put a shirt on. Now we got a guy who's got a belt, and it needs freeing. And I'm going to bring on Ethan now to rap with you about all things NBA, NCAA, CBA. Let's bring him on.
Hey, Bomani. First off, I want to say, really sad about the radio show ending. I thought it was fantastic. I thought you did a great job of it. And I kind of wanted to ask you about that. I find that you have a very unique voice and that you're honest about some issues in sports to the point of seeming subversive. Do you think that in part is kind of a blessing and a curse, as in it helps make you you and make you interesting, but it also at the same time makes it hard to stay employed at one particular area for an extended period of time?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, this time everybody wound up unemployed, so that wasn't really the situation on this one. Now, I've had other job situations where I don't think it helped, and it's nothing you can necessarily confirm or point a finger to. But the tricky thing with radio in particular, and I don't think this is nearly as applicable in television, but the problem with radio is the people that matter are advertisers. And something I don't think that people grasp is you want to get ratings and you want your ratings to be high, but ultimately people know how to sell radio stations without selling ratings, which means they wind up at the whims of whoever is handling the advertising. Well, listen to your typical local sports talk radio station. Well, what are you going to hear them advertising? Stuff like mortgages and, things along those lines. A lot of people, I think, feel like they have a very clear idea of who their demographic is, which is really white men from 25 to 54. And then they think they have an idea of what those white men can handle. What they don't realize is if you're, say, a 45-year-old white man right now, then when, like, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 came out, you were, 15 years old? I think people greatly misunderstand generally what the median listener is able to handle and is willing to listen to and what they'll enjoy, because a lot of times you wind up selling to advertisers. But it is definitely easier to stay employed if you're not ruffling anybody's feathers. It's not nearly as much fun, though. If you got some things you want to say, then you just got to say it. And there's a lot of ways to make money. No one ever said you had to do a radio show,
Yeah, well, speaking for the population of white men, I do think that there are some things that the group doesn't necessarily want to handle. Something I've always been fascinated about in sports is that a lot of people, and some of them black too, I'm assuming, don't want to admit that race is a factor in our perceptions of athletes and our judgments of them. Like, I remember most recently, Peyton Hillis, or however you say his name, the Cleveland Browns running back, became the cover guy on Madden. And it's like nobody could come out and say why it was, which is that he's a white guy and it's a novelty position. You don't have any white running backs, and a lot of people like that. All the speech surrounding it was coded, and it was that he's an underdog kind of guy and he's gritty like John Riggins. And all the comments on anything I read about it was like, why do you have to make this about race? It's that is exciting. I guess what I'm asking you is, do you think that there is a major blind spot in the part of white sports fans, speaking in generalities, where we don't want to admit that race plays a role like it does in our impressions of athletes?
Well, I don't know if it's even white sports fans. I think it's white people in general. And it's nothing insulting or personal to say about this. Like, the question I always ask people is, where did you get your racism repellent? Like, we all live here. We all live in this. We all came up in this with the same images and everything else. But amazingly, the only people who aren't caught up on race are all these white people. Like that's the part that blows my mind every time. We got all this racism, but nobody can ever point to where exactly it is. It's like conceptually we have racism, but we have no racists because people don't want to take this have this come to them personally. Reality is none of us are so good and so brilliant that we would be able to force out some of these images and some of these thought processes that we all were raised with and we just don't think a great deal about. None of us are that good. I think the part that is difficult a lot of times for sports fans for them to acknowledge that race plays a role is that it forces them to then go back and look at themselves. And then they say, well, hey, I've never considered myself to be racist because nobody wants to say that they're that type. But like I say, where did your repellent come from? So when you get in and you start pointing things out, I think people are able to decompress a little bit and figure it out. But I do think another part of it is we just kind of have to recognize amongst ourselves that like little messed up things that we think and or say, they're not that big a deal. The issues of racism that really matter are the big macro stuff, like the throwing black men in prison at ridiculous rates and stuff like that. But your little views that you got about an athlete, this may be what you think or whatever it is, but if you're scared to stop and deconstruct what it is that you think, then chances are you're scared about what it's going to say about you. The truth is, it's probably not going to say much more about you than you grew up in the same world than the rest of us did.
Do you think part of the problem is a matter of vocabulary? Because we have this really bad pejorative term of racism, and it's quite broad. A lot of things can fit under that umbrella. You know, if you're white and you like Peyton Hillis, and kind of identify with him culturally and want to root for somebody who looks a little like you, is that racism or is that just cultural identification? You know, like, do you think that part of the problem is that we don't have enough nuance in the terminology of what people's impressions are?
Well, I think that what you said is right, but I think there's another step to it. I think part of it is a limited vocabulary in large measure, but the other part of it is rather than, and I wasn't alive for a lot of this, but I can see much of it go on now. Rather than stop and think and consider what some of these issues are, what people have decided to do is, well, hey, we're just not going to talk about race, right? We're just not going to talk about it at all. That'll be the way for us to avoid this racism. And it doesn't avoid anything. It just kind of winds up tabling it, and people haven't stopped to consider and think about things. So, for example, Arizona State, the thing that came up when they played on Friday night, they had the blackout game. Some people in the crowd had painted their skin black. Now, is that racist? Probably not. It's not the smartest move that you ever made, but it's not racist. The problem is that we have a knee-jerk thing, right? Blackface equals bad. Why does blackface equal bad? Because the blackface stuff we talked about before was overwhelmingly with these stereotypical images. The problem is not simply making your skin darker. Robert Downey Jr. got an Academy Award nomination for a blackface role that he killed. He was fantastic, and the role was absolutely perfect. And they said that when they did it, they had to get it absolutely perfect because otherwise it would be a colossal disaster, and they were right. But that shows you right there, the issue is not necessarily that you're painting yourself black or whatever it is. But instead of kind of breaking down what it was, the solution was, hey, nope, we can't do that. This is just a thing we can't do. So we haven't really thought about it. So we got all these different things, I think, as they relate to race, that rather than stopping and taking some time and figuring out what the issue happens to be, what people have just done is decided, you know what, I'm just going to skip this. I'm just going to avoid it. And so we wind up at these moments and we have the same damn conversations like once a year when these things come up. Like it's the same discussion. It's just, well, I guess people need to learn and people don't know any better. But where were they when we talked about this last year? They were figuring out, hey, maybe we just don't need to talk about this little topic at all. And reality is, of course, people need to talk more about it. But the problem is not that we're limited in having the word racist. I would argue that the problem is that we've decided that we want to avoid that word at all costs, so we haven't bothered to do any thinking on the in-between, that there's some graduated levels about, what kind of stuff there is. So, like, one day I'll give an example. I was out at a bar with a buddy of mine, and he'd been drinking before I got there, and I don't drink, which always makes for awkward conversations when they've been drinking in bars, right? So we're sitting there talking, and invariably this seems to happen. You go to a bar with a bunch of white dudes, somebody all of a sudden wants to talk about race. I don't know why. Alcohol comes in, now we're going to talk about race. So
that's what's happening right here.
Yeah, it wasn't one of those, you're black and I'm white. It wasn't one of those. But we sitting there talking, and we're good friends, and I forget what we were talking about related to racism. And by the time it got to the end, he told me that he thought that if racism ended, then black people would have a problem because then they would not have anything to complain about. At which point, I stood up to leave, and he got, oh, no, don't leave, I'm like, no, I'm gone. Don't worry. I'll talk to you tomorrow. but today I have to go. Like, what he said was really, really messed up. It didn't necessarily make him a bad person. It's just one messed up thing he happened to say.